Tag Tuesday, time for a tag. And the tag I'm doing is an original tag by Tom LA Books, Tom, and he kindly tagged me in his original tag. It's taken me a week to get around to doing it because it's a good tag with good questions, but where you have to think of a book that fits the prompts and yeah, like you have to get your brain going a little to pick them, unless you like Steve Donahue and have like a kind of a some sort of Rolodex of books in your head and can just like pop one out in answer to anything, any given question at any given moment. The questions are quite long, but the prompt bit of them is logical and straightforward, if that makes sense. So I'm going to have to read the questions from my tablet so I don't get them wrong, because they're all kind of the tag is called, here we go, the Divine Comedy Reader Tag, because a few of us are reading the Divine Comedy at the moment with Tom's help, and they're all inspired by the Divine Comedy, but you don't need to be reading it to do the tag, just to reassure you. Okay, so question one is Virgil and Dante. And it asks you to think of one of your favourite books featuring a master-pupil relationship between two of the main characters, because that's what happens in the Divine Comedy. Yeah, Dante is almost like the student, the pupil, and Virgil is his guide, just like Tom is being our guide through the Divine Comedy. So I was trying to think of, and I could think of books with like kind of governesses and pupils, and it wasn't quite, it wasn't coming. And then I thought of a slightly different kind of elder young person relationship, and that's the relationship between a grandparent and a grandchild. That is a kind of a sometimes a very special connection, and I thought of two books that have a really very beautiful grandparent grandchild relationship where the grandchild really learns from their grandparent. And one is The Summer Book by Tove Jansson, a very special book about a grandparent, a grandmother and granddaughter spending the summer on a little island in off the coast of Norway. Yeah, absolute gem of a book, that one. The other is The Blue Sky by Galsan Shinag, and this is a book from Mongolia, and it's kind of a memoir but fictionalized, and the relationship between the author as a small boy and his grandmother, who comes and lives, she loses her herd and comes and lives in their yurt. That's that's not officially the right word for them, is it? But that's what they're called in this translation. And yeah, he there's a kind of tremendous closeness between them and a tremendous sorrow when he finally loses her. Another book I would recommend. Question number two, The Psychedelic Eagle. Okay, which uh, comes in Paradiso, the paradise. In the fire I saw distinctly shown in golden fire the image of an eagle's head and neck. And the prompt is a book that fired up your visual imagination more than others. Well, I didn't have to struggle with this one because this is a book that I read really recently, like between Christmas and Easter, and it's Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, and it's kind of fantasy at the very literary end of that, but it has the most extraordinary setting of any book that I've read in recent years. And you have to visualize this setting, the house it's called, in order for the book to work at all. But it's no problem to visualize it. It's so vivid and fascinating and unusual. Definitely a book that I would warmly recommend as kind of current fiction. And if you want help in visualizing the setting, you just have to Google Piranesi, and his designs, his kind of architectural labyrinth-like designs of buildings, and you'll see what I mean. if I were the kind of clever booktuber who did nice editing, I'd put up a picture of a Piranesi print, but I can't and won't. But I'll try and put a link in the show notes. Question number 3. Count Ugolino. He's a character who appears in Inferno in Canto XXXIII. And then hunger had more power than ever sorrow had over me. The prompt is, a book you read with such graphic and horrific descriptions that you will never forget them. Well, that's a bit scary, isn't it, as a prompt? And Inferno does have some very vivid and disturbing descriptions. The book I'm going to choose for this is a book called Senselessness by Horacio Castellanos Moya, and he's a writer from El Salvador. And Senselessness is set in an unnamed Central American country, but yeah, it's obviously El Salvador. Although, in fact, what it describes, you could have written the same book about Guatemala or, well, you know, a number. And because what happens in that book is the protagonist is a writer who takes an editing job for money, and he's being employed by a kind of church commission to edit into a book the oral testimonies that have been recorded and written down now of villagers who survived army massacres in their villages. So we're sort of like indigenous villages, and it's horrific. And of course they were horrific, and those things did happen. And this is one of those books where kind of fiction, though, almost like takes it to another level in addressing that. So it's a book about it. It's a book of fiction about creating a book of non-fiction as honestly as possible about stuff that is almost indescribable, but is described in the words of these sort of peasants, in which this writer, this professional writer, the narrator, finds an extraordinary kind of poetry, but doing that job of editing them basically sends him mad. I've probably not sold the book to you, have I? But actually, it's a very good book. Yeah, it's one that I read it a few years ago for a scallydandle, as it were, to read a book from El Salvador, and it is fixed in my brain, imprinted there, I would say. So, prompt number 4. The Cinematic Archangel. This is from Inferno Canto IX. I saw more than 1,000 souls of the ruined flee before one who strode across the Styx. It's one of those big moments in Dante's Divine Comedy where the Dante just conjures up a scene that is like you feel it should be on the big screen in the cinema, and that's one of those moments. So the prompt is, what book that's not been adapted for cinema would you like to make into a movie or TV series if you were a producer with unlimited financial means? Now, this was another of those ones that took a bit of thinking about for me, but I came up with an answer, which is The Successor by Ismail Kadare. Now, he's an Albanian author, and I think actually he has he had the Nobel Prize? He's kind of like the best known author from Albania, and it's a book about the sort of the death of a dictator, as it were, and the successor. And why do I think it would make a good book? Because it's a literary book, but that reads like a thriller in a way, like a very dark political thriller. And I think that you could make a very successful, dark, intense, thriller-like book for it. And of course, Albania is just like brilliant for locations, isn't it, for a film, because it almost got kind of like fixed in time because of the regime and what was happening there. And so I think it would be great to go and shoot this film there. And it could be very, yeah, very intense. And, but actually, you know, strong plot, strong characters. It's not a straightforward book, but it would make, I think, you could make it into a very um, gripping film. So, question number 5, The Noble Castle. This is from Inferno Canto IV. The master of those who know, sitting in a philosophic family who look to him and do him honour. So, this asks for your favourite book by a pre-Christian philosopher or a book about ancient Greece that you liked. Well, there's lots of books about ancient Greece that I liked, but I thought I jolly well will talk about an ancient Greek philosopher. Well, actually, the book which I know, and how we know more about this philosopher, is by a Roman. So it's a Roman book in Latin about an ancient Greek and philosophy. So this is a book by Lucretius, De Rerum Natura, about the philosophy of Epicurus. So Lucretius was writing this, you know, like, I don't know, probably a couple of hundred years after Epicurus had had his ideas. So he was writing in the 1st century BC, and yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I should have checked when Epicurus lived, but you know, before. And he was explaining Epicurus for a Roman audience, and I read parts of that in Latin when I was doing my Latin A level, which should have been as dull as dishwater, but it wasn't to me because well, Epicurus is associated with hedonism, you know, and people assume that that means, oh, just oh, you know, eat, drink, and be merry, and you know, for tomorrow we may die, you know, that sort of philosophy. But actually, it's a lot more subtle than that. What he said he was trying to do, I suppose, was kind of remove the fear, people's fear of the supernatural and of death by appealing almost to reason, and by saying, you know, that everything in life can be explained. You know, it's like kind of almost like scientific rationalism before we really had the science to rely on, and you know that you should aim in your life for kind of modest, sustainable sort of pleasures, because this life is all we get. But we don't need to worry about death because, you know, do you have to worry about the time before you were born? No, you're not aware of it, and death will be the same. So, you know, chill and have a pleasant time. Yeah, nice philosophy. I like it. There you go. That was number 5. Now, oh, I've got to go back to my long questions here. Number 6, Paolo and Francesca. That's from Inferno Canto V. It's a kind of like they're lovers. They ended up in hell because they didn't restrain their lust, I guess. But love which absolves none who are loved from loving. A book of any genre with a love story you particularly liked as part of the central plot or not. That's a nice prompt. And the one that came to mind for me was the first book in the Kristen Lavransdatter trilogy by Sigrid Undset. Now, this is a book by a Norwegian woman. She was writing in the 1920s, writing this, but writing about writing historical fiction. In fact, you know, it's set in medieval Norway, and the first book, The Wreath, is really about a most extraordinary love story between a man and a woman, a young girl, really, you know, kind of. She's got that kind of teenage emotion, I suppose, you know, rebellious love that says, I'm going to follow my heart and not the person that you think I ought to marry. And the physical attraction is very real and convincing, and that's really interesting, and it's that kind of medieval setting, and written by, say, a Norwegian woman in the 1920s. It's good. One of the things I want to do this year, and I'm saying this here to make sure I do, is read the other 2 books in the trilogy, because, you know, they're all, this is a combined edition, but I read the first book, loved it, and haven't read the other 2, so I really must do something about that, mustn't I? Prompt number 7, Ulysses. So in the Inferno, in Canto 26, we meet Ulysses. Okay, and until the sea had closed up over us, is Tom's quote. Name a book you loved in any genre whose protagonist leads a group of people to follow his or her courage and ambition into an adventure. Well, again, I had to think about this a bit, and all sorts of possibilities leapt to mind. But then I decided to pick a children's book that I love dearly, and I think it was because it was in my mind when I was doing the hindsight 2020 tag. Although I talked about other things, this is a children's book that's dear to my heart, and so I've been reminded of it, and that is Emily the Detectives by Eric Kastner. Now, he was a German writer, and he wrote this in 1929, I think, something like that. And it's almost like it's the first children's detective book, where you get like a child protagonist that has to solve a crime, and Emil, the lead character, there he is on the front. He kind of gathers a group of boys and one girl around him to help him track down the person who stole his money, and it's enormous fun. It's a tremendous book. It's never been out of print since it was originally written. Kastner is interesting because his books were burned by the Nazis, but he didn't leave Germany. He kind of hung on in there and went, kind of, chose to kind of keep his head down and survive. But later became an alcoholic. Interesting man. One of the brilliant things about this book is the illustrations, and you have to get a copy with the original illustrations by Walter Trier. Well, it's probably Walter, isn't it, if I had a decent German accent. And these were in the original edition of German edition, but they were used in the original English edition as well. And this one I have here is from 1933. I think it first came out in 1931, so it's sort of, when the book was new. And let me show you one. Look, there's one of Walter Trier's illustrations. They're so much of their time, aren't they? Germany in the at the end of the 20s. Yeah, brilliant. Walter actually, he was Jewish, and he did flee Germany, and because he kind of was known for his anti-Nazi cartoons, and he came to London in 1936 and lived the rest of his life in London and then Canada. Yeah, England and Canada. There we go. If you haven't read it, do. I don't read middle grade, but I know lots of people do. And if you do, that's one to read, if you know what I mean. Yeah. Oh, where am I? Last of the proper prompt number 8, St. Bernard the Poet, from Paradiso. Love in your womb was fun to fire again. And the prompt for this is, what is your favourite poetry book in translation? And I think that by the time I finish reading the Divine Comedy with Tom's help, maybe Dante's Divine Comedy will be my favourite poetry book in translation. But we haven't got to the end yet. We're a long way off. It's going to take the rest of this year and well into 2022 to finish it at the very gentle rate we're going. So I won't pick that. Nor will I pick Paradise Lost, because that's not in translation, although that was my best poetry book I've read this month. And when you read something from the 17th century, it feels a bit like you're translating it to yourself in your head to modern English. No, what I'm going to pick is this, which is the Mabinogi. And this is kind of, it starts out with cheating, but because this didn't start out as poetry, but it is in translation. It started out as oral Celtic, British stories, the Mabinogion, and then they were written down in Welsh, which was, one of the sort of original languages, I guess, of the British, in the 14th century. And this book is Matthew Francis. He's actually an English poet, but he did move to Wales. Kind of translating it from the Welsh and then turning it into I was going to say contemporary poetry. I mean, it's not contemporary but they're like new poems based on a traditional Welsh epic, if that makes sense, and just very satisfying. I can't, yeah. Think about giving it a read if you want. It's like this is like fantasy fiction. It's like if you read Lord of the Rings or you read Icelandic sagas. Well, this is the Welsh version, but he makes some really good poems out of it. So that was all the tags. Interesting questions. Thank you, Tom. Now, and the last thing to do, of course, is to tag some people. Now, I'm going to tag Steve Donoghue, although Tom did that, but just because I want, if Steve does it, then it kind of, I think it would give it extra legs, and I think he would enjoy it. I'm going to tag Heidi of My Reading Life and Doris of Alder Books. Now, both of you, please don't feel that I'm only tagging you so that I get to see more kitten footage, but it could be true. I'll tag Mark Nash because I know he'd have some good and different books for these answers. Sean the Book Maniac and Brian of Bookish because they both do a good tag. Alan, Big Hard Books and Classics, because I know he enjoys a tag, and Kelly of Books I'm Not Reading because she's a good tagger, isn't she? And finally, Tilly of Tilly's Shelf because she's back in the country and no idea whether she'll find time to do any tags, but I'll throw her in anyway. And happy Tuesday, everybody.